All right, so get this. We're diving deep today into stress management,
Yeah.
but with a twist. We're looking at EMDR. Usually it's a technique you think of for trauma therapy, right?
Yeah.
But our source, stress management with EMDR.mp3, uses it for like everyday stress.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets kind of wild. We're talking inner gardens, like tapping into your unconscious and stuff, even using those times, when you were a kid and you were learning to walk and you fell down a bunch, and how that builds resilience. So it's not just about chilling out. It's about using our minds in ways we don't even realize. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give us like a little background on EMDR itself?
Sure. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's based on this idea that our brains, they can heal from tough experiences. Usually it involves these specific eye movements or other kinds of bilateral stimulation, which we'll get
Yeah.
into later. Now applying EMDR to just general stress management, that's a cool concept
Yeah.
because it suggests we might have all these untapped resources for resilience, that we haven't even thought about.
I'm already hooked. One thing that jumped out from the source was this metaphor. They talk about the mind as a garden. Like you have to tend to it so you prevent weeds, which are like the negative thoughts and feelings, from taking over. Is that just a fluffy analogy, or is there something deeper going on there?
Actually, it's a pretty powerful metaphor when you really think about it. It connects to a lot of mindfulness practices. And that whole idea of cultivating a positive mental environment, it's not just like thinking happy thoughts all the time, but being aware of the thoughts we're planting
Yeah.
and choosing to nurture the ones that help us. But like any metaphor, it's got its limits. Like it might not work for everyone or every kind of stress. Someone dealing with a really serious issue might need more than just gardening their thoughts.
Makes sense. Like the garden thing might work for daily frustrations. But if you're going through a huge life change, you probably need stronger tools.
Yeah, exactly. The source also talks a lot about accessing the unconscious mind as a key to managing stress. They compare it to how we learn to walk as kids, falling down over and over, but eventually getting stronger and more skilled.
Okay, but the unconscious mind, it seems so mysterious and murky. How do we even tap into it? And how does that help with stress?
That's where it gets really interesting. The audio source suggests that paying attention to our physical sensations is one way to connect with the unconscious.
Wait, so by noticing how our body feels, we can get insights into our unconscious mind. How does that work?
It's all about the mind-to-body connection. Our bodies, they're always giving us signals about how we're feeling emotionally, even if we don't realize it. By tuning into those sensations, we can get valuable insights into how stress is affecting us and start to regulate our responses better.
So like if I'm feeling tense in my shoulders or have a knot in my stomach, that's my unconscious mind telling me about my stress levels.
Exactly. And the source goes even further, suggesting we can actually use those physical sensations to access deeper levels of awareness and tap into our inner resources for coping with stress. They talk about this tingling sensation as evidence of accessing those deeper levels.
Tingling. Okay, I need you to break this down for me. What's the science behind that? And is it a reliable indicator?
So tingling might not be something everyone experiences, but it could be related to activating your parasympathetic nervous system, which is our body's rest and digest system. When that system is activated, it slows our heart rate down, lowers blood pressure, and promotes a feeling of calm, this relaxation response. Sometimes it can feel like tingling or warmth in your body, like your body's way of saying, okay, we're safe now, we can chill out.
So it's not about the tingling itself,
Yeah,
but what it represents physiologically,
yeah,
like going from a stress state to a more relaxed state.
exactly. The source also goes into specific techniques, and one that caught my attention was this idea of letting whatever happens happen. They repeat this phrase throughout the audio, almost like a mantra.
Yeah, that one struck me as kind of strange at first. It almost sounded like they were saying, just give up and let stress run wild.
Right, it definitely needs some unpacking. I don't think it's about becoming passive when you're stressed, but more about recognizing the difference between what we can control and what we can't.
So it's about choosing our battles,
Yeah.
focusing our energy on the things we can actually change, and accepting the things we can't.
Exactly. It's a subtle but important difference, and it connects to this idea that sometimes trying to control every outcome actually creates more stress.
That's interesting. I can see how clinging to control can backfire and make things worse.
It's like trying to hold on to water. The tighter you squeeze, the more slips through your fingers. Sometimes the best approach is to relax your grip and let things unfold naturally.
Okay, that's a helpful image.
Yeah.
So we've got this interesting approach to stress management. It involves accessing the unconscious mind, cultivating a positive mental environment, and embracing this idea of letting go of control. But how do we actually put this into practice? What are some tangible techniques they suggest in the audio?
Well, they get into a bunch of techniques. But one that's central to EMDR is bilateral stimulation. I know we touched on this earlier, but can you explain what it is and how it works?
Honestly, I'm still a little fuzzy on that.
Yeah.
I know it's about engaging both sides of the brain, but beyond that, I'm lost.
It's pretty fascinating. The theory is that by stimulating both sides of your brain, usually through eye movements or tapping, or like alternating sounds, we can help process and integrate difficult experiences. Think of it like building a bridge between the emotional and logical parts of your brain, allowing for a more balanced response to stress.
Okay, so it's like creating a more harmonious flow of information
Mm-hmm.
between the different parts of our brain. But how does the audio source incorporate bilateral stimulation if it can't like guide eye movements?
They use rhythmic language and repetition to create a similar effect. Remember those phrases they kept repeating, like, just notice, or let whatever happens happen? It's not just for emphasis. It's a deliberate technique to create this gentle back and forth rhythm in the brain.
So it's like a sonic version of bilateral stimulation. They're using language to tap into those same neural pathways. Clever. And speaking of techniques, they also guide you through some visualizations, like picturing your mind as a garden and seeing those stress weeds getting cleared away. I have to admit I'm a bit skeptical about visualization. Is it really more than just wishful thinking?
I get your skepticism, but visualization actually has some solid science behind it. When we vividly imagine something, our brains fire in similar patterns, as if we were actually experiencing it. It's like why athletes use visualization to get better. Their brains are basically practicing the movements and building muscle memory, even without physically doing the action.
Wow, so our brains don't really tell the difference between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. That's pretty mind-blowing. But how does that apply to stress management?
By visualizing a calm and peaceful scene, for example, we can trigger that relaxation response in our bodies, like giving our nervous system a mini vacation, even if things are still stressful around us.
I like the sound of a mini vacation for my nervous system. But I'm also curious about those times when stress just feels overwhelming. Like it's more than just needing a mental vacation. Are there techniques for dealing with those intense stress spikes?
Absolutely. And that's where that letting whatever happens happen concept comes back in. It's about surrendering to the present moment, acknowledging we can't control everything, and trusting that we have what we need inside to handle whatever comes our way.
That sounds great in theory, but isn't there a risk of becoming complacent or irresponsible if we just let things happen?
That's a valid concern, and it's a tricky balance to find. It's not about giving up on your goals or ignoring your responsibilities. It's more about shifting your focus from resisting what is to accepting what is, and then choosing your actions wisely.
So it's not passivity, it's about choosing our response. Instead of reacting without thinking, it's about recognizing that we always have a choice in how we respond to stress.
Exactly, and that can be really empowering because it reminds us that we're not victims of our circumstances, but we're active participants in our own experience.
I'm starting to see how this all fits together. We use relaxation techniques and bilateral stimulation to calm our nervous system, visualization to shift our mental state, and this idea of letting go to cultivate acceptance and empower ourselves to choose our response.
You got it. And while the source material mainly focuses on visualization and relaxation, EMDR therapy actually uses a much wider range of techniques, some of which can be adapted for managing everyday stress.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of those other techniques?
Well, one technique is called cognitive interweaves. It involves gently challenging negative thought patterns and replacing them with more balanced and realistic perspectives.
So it's like we're actively weeding our mental garden, pulling out those negative thought patterns that are choking the growth of our well-being.
That's a great way to put it. Another technique involves identifying and processing past experiences. That might be contributing to how we're responding to stress now. This can be especially helpful for people who find themselves reacting to stress in unhealthy ways over and over.
So it's like by understanding the root of our stress, we can start to change how we respond to it in the present. Fascinating. But I have to ask, how much of this is actually backed by science? Is there evidence that these techniques actually work?
That's a great question. I mean, it all sounds really promising, but I'm always a little skeptical of self-help techniques that seem too good to be true.
I get it. It's important to be careful, especially when it comes to our mental and emotional well-being.
Right.
So is there like actual research to back this up?
Well, EMDR itself has a growing body of research supporting its use in trauma therapy. But applying it to general stress management, that's still pretty new. But a lot of the underlying principles, like mindfulness relaxation techniques and cognitive reframing, those have been studied a lot. and they've been shown to be effective for reducing stress and improving overall well-being.
Okay, that's good to know. So even if the specific way EMDR is applied to everyday stress is still being figured out, the core parts have a solid scientific foundation.
Exactly. And it's worth remembering that even if we don't fully understand how it all works, if a technique helps someone manage their stress and have a better life, that's valuable in itself.
I appreciate that perspective. Sometimes it's about finding what works for you, even if we don't have all the scientific answers yet. But let's get practical. What are some specific things our listeners can do to start applying these ideas to their own lives?
Well, the source material really emphasizes relaxation as a foundational practice. They guide you through a whole body relaxation exercise. But you can incorporate similar techniques into your day, even if you only have a few minutes.
Right, like deep breathing or progressive muscle relaxation. But how does that tie into the bigger picture of stress management with EMDR? It seems a little basic compared to some of the other concepts we've talked about.
It might seem basic, but it's actually really important for shifting your nervous system out of that fight or flight mode and into a more relaxed and receptive state. Remember, when we're all stressed out, our ability to think clearly and solve problems, it's limited. Relaxation techniques help create space for those parts of our brain to come back online.
So it's not just about chilling out for a few minutes. It's about actually changing our physiological state to be better equipped to handle stress. I get it. But what about those times when stress feels like it's coming at you from all directions and a few deep breaths just aren't enough? What are some other tools we can use?
That's where visualization can be really helpful. The audio source guides you to visualize your mind as a garden and to imagine clearing away those pesky stress weeds. Now, this might sound a little out there, but there's actually a lot of research that supports using visualization for stress management.
Wait, you're telling me that just imagining things can actually change how our bodies respond to stress? How does that even work?
It's pretty amazing. Our brains are wired to respond to mental imagery in much the same way they respond to real experiences. When we vividly imagine a peaceful scene, our brains and bodies start to relax, just as if we were actually in that peaceful environment.
So if I imagine myself on a beach sipping a tropical drink, my brain might actually start to calm down, even if I'm stuck in traffic.
Exactly. And the more vivid and detailed the visualization, the stronger the effect.
Okay, I'm starting to see the potential here. So we've got relaxation techniques and visualization. What else can we add to our stress-busting toolkit?
Well, remember that concept of letting whatever happens happen. It's not just about acceptance. It's also about recognizing what we can and can't control. A lot of stress comes from trying to force outcomes or resisting change. When we can learn to surrender to the present moment and focus our energy on what we can influence, we naturally reduce a lot of stress.
I'm starting to see how this ties back to the garden metaphor. We can't control the weather or the pests, but we can tend to the soil, plant the seeds, and nurture the growth.
Exactly. And just as a gardener learns to work with nature, we can learn to work with our own minds and bodies. And just like a gardener learns to work with nature, we can learn to work with our own minds and bodies.
This has been like a super insightful deep dive. We've gone from the science behind EMDR to practical stuff like relaxation, visualization, and even like reframing how we think about stress.
It's been a fascinating exploration. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one last thought. What if, instead of trying to get rid of stress completely, which is probably impossible anyway, we focused on building our ability to handle stress with resilience, grace, and maybe even a little humor? What if we embrace the idea that stress, even though it's usually unpleasant, can actually help us grow and learn about ourselves?
That's a powerful question to think about. And for our listeners, I encourage you to think about your own experiences with stress. What are your go-to ways of coping? What patterns do you notice in how you respond to stress? And how can the ideas we've talked about today help you to deal with stress in a more resilient and empowered way? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.